Hello and welcome to week 6 of Choices, Foreign Policy Issues in the 2020 election. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you here with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other sessions in the Choices Election Issues series, other upcoming events, and how to join as a member on our website at irckc.org. The 2020 presidential election will present the American people with consequential choices around international challenges and the future of US foreign policy. In these 8 weeks leading up to November 3rd, we're talking with notable experts on foreign policy issues relevant to this year's election and what comes next. Rather than advocate a particular approach or outcome, the Nonpartisan Choices series is meant to inform voters through a presentation of historical context and a detailed examination of the foreign policy platforms of the major party candidates. We welcome diverse perspectives and encourage the community to join us in meaningful discourse around these issues of global importance. We hope you'll engage that way with us this evening as we explore the great power competition, looking at China, Russia, and the United States. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Choices series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming weeks. We are grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Choices series possible. In particular, thank you to supporting series sponsors Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group. We also appreciate the contribution of supporting conversation sponsor Greg and Suzanne Hoffman. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Jack Zhang is Assistant Professor of East Asian Politics at the University of Kansas and directs the KU Trade War Lab. He received his PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego, and was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton University. His dissertation examines when and why economically interdependent countries use military versus economic coercion in foreign policy disputes. Jack, thanks so much for being here. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew, for the opportunity to be part of this excellent series. I'm relatively new to KU and to Kansas City, so it's really wonderful to be included in the IRC community. Thank you also to our audience members for joining us tonight. We've decided to run this talk as an interview format. So for the first 30 minutes, I've prepared a set of stage setting questions for our speaker. I ask that audience members please write questions as they come to mind in the Q&A feature, and I will collect these, organize them, and we'll spend the second half of tonight's discussion with those questions. Tonight's topic is great power competition, the management of which is one of the most critical challenges for US foreign policy. And we are lucky to be joined by a world-class expert on this topic who manages one of the most influential bipartisan think tanks in DC. Richard Fontaine is the CEO of the Center for a New American Security, or CNAS, where he's worked since 2009. Before that, he was a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, and also worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Fontaine currently serves as the executive director of the Trilateral Commission and has been an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's a native in New Orleans and holds degrees from Tulane University and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Please join me in a virtual round of applause for Richard Fontaine. So to start us off on the first question, Richard, I was wondering if you could speak to sort of the definition of great power competition. So in 2017, the national security strategy lays out three sets of foreign policy challenges facing the United States: revisionist powers of China and Russia, rogue states like Iran and North Korea, which I believe IRC is doing an event on next week, and transnational threats like terrorism. So how are these, how's great power competition different from these other two challenges in scope and scale? And what sets foreign policy towards China and Russia apart from foreign policy with any other country? Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks, Jack, to you and to Matthew and to IRC and everybody joining. I am very happy to have this conversation. I only regret that I'm sitting in my house in outside of Washington, D.C., rather than anticipating some barbecue in Kansas City. So that is an omission I hope to correct once our world gets back to something approaching more normal. It's a great question. What is this great power competition we talk so much about? And of course, there's two parts of it. There's the great power and there's competition. So what's a great power? Well, there's various definitions of that. I mean, probably the simplest one is vague, a big, powerful country that defines its interests in global terms. That's not really enough. I mean, you can, some people will say, well, it's a country with global interests that has a survivable second strike nuclear capability, which, would eliminate, so you could sort of do that. For all intents and purposes, when people talk about great power competition, what they mean is Russia and China. It's a shorthand for Russia and China. There's not a great power competitor sort of waiting in the wings to join the club of those who we would consider great power competitors. And then there's the competition. What is competition? Well, you're not in a cooperative or partner-like kind of arrangement with a country. Where, for example, like we thought we might be with Russia in the 1990s, or we thought we might be with China we certainly were with China all through most of the Cold War after normalization, and then kind of off and on since then. And you're not in conflict or confrontation and so you're in this competition. It's a search for advantage over your competitors in key fields. And so we are in this competition with China especially, but also in a meaningful way with Russia. And that competition has sort of various vectors: military aspect to it, where we're competing for military advantage, an economic aspect, a technological aspect, an ideological aspect, or sort of an ideas, a diplomatic, a competition for allies and friends. And so you add all this up, and that puts us in a competition with China and Russia. It's different than our other national security issues, and it's different than some of the ones that the U.S. has faced before. It's different than the other ones by virtue of the size and sort of geopolitical throw weight of the two countries, and it's different with respect to China in the deep economic intertwining between the United States and China, and between our allies in China. Which makes it totally different than Iran or North Korea or any of the sort of potential problem states. But it's also different than past what we would call great power competition. I mean, it's the case that at least in the past 120, 130 years, the United States has never faced a great power competitor or combination of great power competitors that had more than about 45% of US GDP. I mean, the Soviet Union was a military giant, but it was kind of an economic dwarf, and we certainly weren't very intertwined. In China, by purchasing power, is already at 100%. By any measure, seems like it's headed toward 100% of US GDP. And that makes the nature of certainly the US-China competition categorically different in some key ways than what we've gone through before.
Yeah, could I, so building on your answer here, could we tease apart sort of the difference, right? So we talked about the similarities between China and Russia as great powers and the nature of competition, the fact that they have nuclear weapons and yet differ in strategic objectives from the US, right? So you've alluded to sort of the economic size as one of the factors that differentiate them. Are there other ways that we can mark kind of the different interests of China and Russia? And are they aligned in their sort of geopolitical outlook against the United States as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the catch-all term "great power competition" to describe the nature of the competitions or the nature of the relations between the United States with China and Russia is not terribly effective or efficient. I mean, U.S. relations with China are very different than U.S. relations with Russia. Those two countries have some shared interests. Among those shared interests are not allowing the United States to play what they would believe to be a dominant role in the various domains in which they believe we do, whether for Russia, the kind of near or broad, as it would define it, China globally, but in key institutions and things like that. So they have some shared interests, but their outlooks are very different. And the way they define their own national interests are very different. And our military and economic relations with them are very different. So it's shorthand to sort of lump these together in sort of one big competition, but we're really talking about two very different competitions, one with Russia, one with China, with two different toolkits, two different sets of objectives, two different kind of, whatever you want to call them, adversaries, competitors, whatever. And some shared activities and interests between them that make things different. And if you hear my dog, by the way, that's just, I got 4 kids, a dog, 3 guinea pigs and a cat. So, it's, you get one, you get all. So, there is an interaction between them that is meaningful and actually increasing and sort of accelerating, which influences the way we think about these things. But there's really not one competition, there's two.
Thank you. Just to drill down on this topic a little bit, right? So there's two competitions, and I want you to give some examples maybe to our audience members about the areas in which Russian and Chinese interests are different or divergent, right? And beyond sort of growing antagonism with the United States, in what other areas are they aligned?
I'm sorry, say that last part again.
Just beyond sort of where are Chinese and Russian interests divergent, and if you set aside competition with the U.S., right, which both Moscow and Beijing have a stake in what other ways are their interests aligned?
Yeah, so their interests align almost certainly in kind of a negative agenda sense. So neither of them wants to see the United States play what they would believe to be an overly dominant role when it comes to either their regions, the Indo-Pacific, or certainly the Western Pacific for China, the near abroad for Russia. They don't want the United States to, as they would see it, change international norms. So, a responsibility to protect becomes, a reason for the United States to engage militarily and overthrow governments where it doesn't like it. They don't like and have a shared interest in seeing the United States not succeed in what they believe to be sort of stirring up color revolutions or promoting democracy, including in their own countries, which they see as a threat to their own hold on power. They have a shared interest in building alternatives to American-dominated arrangements, institutions, standards. Harder to do than it might seem, but they have a shared interest in that kind of thing. And they do stuff together. I mean, they've done joint exercises in the South China Sea. They team up. It used to be the case that at the UN Security Council, Russia would veto and then China would abstain. Now it's both of them veto if they don't like it. There are things they do together. Russia's got to sell its oil and gas to somebody. A lot of sanctions on Russia right now, including from Western Europe. So they sell more to China at a discount than they would otherwise. So they have some shared interests, but it also points to some divergent issues. I mean, I think particularly Vladimir Putin would like to have China kind of on his side without being obviously the junior partner to Beijing. It's not clear that he has a choice in that matter. Again, because he's been sort of ostracized by the Europeans economically and diplomatically. Certainly in Central Asia, historically, they've had divergent issues and tensions. China's One Belt, One Road sort of infrastructure building stuff is most consequential through Southeast Asia across the Indian Ocean, but they're also doing a lot in Central Asia, and that has at least the potential to stir up some tensions and the sense of divergent between them. But I would say there's one kind of big meta difference between the two of them, and that is, I think China is a growing power that ever more has skin in the game of essentially a stable international order. Now, they want an international order that increasingly reflects their own interests, their own fingerprints, that makes things what they would believe to be safer for them. But I think fundamentally, they have an interest in stability. And that's, may not work out that way. You can contest it. We could discuss that. The Russians are a declining power, and every year that goes on, they have less skin in the game. And I think what this has done, there's this whole discussion about, Jack, I'm sure about the Thucydides trap idea and all this other stuff. But my friend Graham Allison has this idea that, as in, Thucydides, as in the Peloponnesian War, it's the rising power that challenges the established power, and that sort of leads to war unless you're really careful. And of course it can, but the declining power can be pretty dangerous too, because they can be a lot more risk tolerant than the rising power. If every year that goes by, you think your position's weakening, and every year that goes by, you have sort of less goodies to be able to get from the arrangement as it is, the more disruptive you're going to feel free to be, and the more risks you're going to take on. And I think there's some instances in history that sort of bear that out. And I think we see some of that in Russia today. I mean, to this day, whether it's meddling in American politics or, I don't know, assassinating people in England or whatever it is, the Russians take risks that the Chinese at least are not yet prepared to take.
Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of observation about the relative sort of power and the trajectory of power and how revisionist, I guess, they are. Shifting a little bit, so now we've been introduced, I guess, to the actors and the adversaries, right? To talk about a little bit about the nature of the competition and what that might look like, the scope of that. So I've been in many conversations where folks have actually accidentally called Russia the USSR, and increasingly it's common when people are talking about China, they say the USSR. So in the op-ed pages, right, we're seeing the analogy to the new Cold War, to the Cold War, right? So how is the emerging 21st century great power competition different than the Cold War of the 20th century? And just sort of as a background caveat, right, it's kind of interesting that all three sort of fought against each other in that, right? Of course, we know the USSR rivalry, but China and the USSR actually fought a big border sort of war, and it pushed China to sort of align with the United States against the USSR, causing and contributing in some ways to the collapse, right? So one dimension, right, in which the dynamics are different, but are there other sort of dimensions that competition today is different than it was than the Cold War?
Yeah, it's a great question, and to lay my cards on the table, I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago saying it's not the new Cold War. And part of that is because exactly what you're talking about, the debate about this tends to be either we are headed into, or we already are in, a Cold War with China, so let's get on with it and make sure that we can succeed. Or if we don't watch ourselves, we're going to get into a new Cold War with China. So let's try to work something out so that we can avoid that. And my view is all of that's wrong, because yes, at a superficial level, you have two superpowers. They both have strong militaries. They have ideological differences. They're in competition for, partners and allies around the world and all this other stuff. Well, there you go. Cold War. We know how to do the Cold War, and we've seen it before and all this other stuff. But I actually think there's a lot more differences than similarities. And if you go in with the Cold War mindset, you get pushed toward policies that aren't going to be effective in what is a very different kind of competition. I mean, for starters, some of the differences are, there were meaningful blocks in the Cold War. You had what we used to call the free world, and you had what we used to call the Eastern Bloc. And then you had competition largely in what we then called the third world or the non-aligned blocs to, get those countries into your column or keep them away from the other column. And what that generated was lots of aid to lots of countries, or looking askance at friendly dictators, or if they'd be on your side, or proxy wars to prevent a country from falling into one category or the other. You don't see any of that now. I mean, what is the Chinese bloc? I mean, the United States has lots of allies. We got 5 treaty allies in Asia, or in the Pacific. We've got NATO, we've got allies. China's got North Korea and maybe Cambodia. It doesn't have allies. There isn't a Chinese bloc. The other thing was that there was very little economic exchange between the blocs. So, the Eastern Bloc mostly traded with itself, and the free world, so to speak, mostly traded and had financial ties with itself. There were some countries in the middle, Yugoslavia, Hungary. We sold Pepsi to the Soviet Union, a bunch of wheat until Reagan did the grain embargo, the whole kind of thing. But for most of it, there was not an economic interdependence that either, that sort of either bounded or had a defining characteristic in that. It was a military and ideological and sort of political kind of thing. Totally different now. I mean, and that has some specific implications. So if we as the United States were to say, China's an enemy, we're going to build a NATO in Asia, just like we got a NATO in Europe that we built during the Soviet Union. We could go around to every country and nobody would sign up for that, because they're not going to sign up for an anti-China alliance. And guess what? The United States is not going to do it either if somebody came to us and proposed it, because of the economic relationship that all of us, including the United States, have with China. And then the final thing is, really the focus of US policy during the Cold War was the geographic containment of a radical ideology sponsored by the Soviet Union, communism. So, my God, if communism was going to be expanded to Laos, we had an interest in fighting it back, right? If it was going to be expanded in the Dominican Republic, we're going to put troops, and the geography of this, I mean, China's not putting, militaries into the field, is not trying to geographically expand in some sort of binary fashion, their model, nor are we really trying to do that in terms of our model. It's much more amorphous kind of competition, really, I think is the right way to think about it, rather than this stark, bipolar kind of world that at least some of us, knew or had studied.
Have studied for me. Yeah. Building on this theme of economic interdependence, right? So as you alluded to, right, the amount of trade and investment between China and the United States is very much unlike sort of between the Soviet Union and the US. I mean, up until the trade war, second largest trading partner. And another dimension is the nature of the exchange of peoples, right? There wasn't, I'm a Chinese American. My parents immigrated here to work at American University, and went to school and grew up here, right? There's millions of Chinese Americans, and there's hundreds of thousands of Americans working in China. That simply wasn't in place during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So that difference in the nature of the challenge, I was wondering how does that then shape sort of the nature of the response that the U.S. needs to muster, right? Is a whole of society approach, a term that the administration has used, necessary? What does that mean? And does it involve cutting off these linkages in terms of trade or people, right? That set this competition apart from the Cold War.
Yeah, so the term du jour in Washington is decoupling, right? So, if you believe that you're in a competition with an adversary, and you want advantage, including economic advantage over them, then you sort of decouple your economies, you decouple your technology, I guess you could decouple the people-to-people ties. I think none of that is either realistic, I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think it's necessary either. There are areas where I think we can and should decouple, interchange, I guess you could say, with China. but they're pretty finite. You know, there are technologies that we would like to protect and not have fall into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. There are technological advantages and market share that we would not like to see China win, certainly at the expense of friendlier sorts of governments and things like that. You know, 5G or, you know, some AI applications or some semiconductors and, you know, microchip sort of stuff. But that doesn't mean we can't sell soybeans to China and they can't sell textiles to the United States. I mean, that just doesn't work. And part of the reason why it doesn't work is because nobody's been able to say what the cost of that would be. I mean, there's a lot of enthusiasm for this idea of decoupling. Tell me how much it costs, not to China, but to America. I mean, last I checked, our unemployment rate is uncomfortably high, and, you know, our economy is not doing great. To imagine that this would be a cost-free exercise would violate every principle of economics 101, for certainly, and fly in the face of the testimony of you would have this effect of imposing a cost on the U.S. economy. Now, that cost, you could say, well, maybe it's very costly, but we're worth bearing it. Look at the kind of costs we bore in the Cold War in order to, you know, vanquish the Soviet Union. But then the question is that necessary? And to me, there's not much that flows necessarily from it is better for China to buy soybeans from Brazil than soybeans from Missouri, or it's better for the United States to buy textiles from Bangladesh than textiles from China on the margin. And then on the people-to-people side, that is, you know, so what the administration does, what I think they were right to do this, was try to stop a very small proportion of Chinese students who are linked to the People's Liberation Army or the Chinese intelligence services from coming over and learning lots of things that they could then go back to China and use. That's a tiny percentage of Chinese students studying in the United States. And of course, we have American students studying over there. And, you know, you have to be careful about how you treat this, because for a couple of reasons. One, it is totally legitimate to not want Chinese who are going to work for the intelligence services of the People's Liberation Army to come over and study nuclear engineering and then go back and then, you know, perfect weapons that are going to then be aimed at the United States. Like that just from a commonsensical thing doesn't work well. But you don't want to go so overboard, one, that you do start to extinguish these people-to-people ties that I think could actually have something of a leavening effect on the relationship. And two, you don't want to treat Chinese people as equivalent to the Chinese Communist Party, which was a distinction not always really drawn during the Cold War between Soviets. And, you know, the beef was not with the Soviet people. And in fact, you know, the Eastern Bloc, you know, actually turned out to like America, and we turned out to like them for the most part. But there's an important distinction to be drawn between, well, certainly between anyone of Chinese descent, which is even another bridge, but you know, the Chinese people and the government and the way the government is approaching their relationship with us and other things. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly.
No, that's very helpful, and I think that distinction is an important one to make, and maybe doesn't translate so well in sort of some of the popular discussion of the topic. Another interesting anecdote or data point on this is a plug for my lab. We did a survey in collaboration with the Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, right, on the question of costs. You know, businesses from the greater Kansas City area, over 70% of them say that tariffs have hurt them, and that's actually a larger percentage that say tariffs were worse for them than COVID, than the pandemic was actually. So it's a substantial sort of cost, right? And it will be interesting going forwards to see how that cost is sort of distributed as this competition develops. So I have one last question before turning it over to, we got a good collection of audience questions here. Please submit your questions if this conversation has sparked some, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about this, a little bit more about the resources necessary, right, to wage this competition well. And especially to point to the analogy of the war on drugs and the war on terror, right? Two policies that received broad bipartisan consensus when they were rolled out, that have since been abandoned by both parties because the enormous sort of resources that were invested do not seem to be commensurate with the amount of policy sort of good that is done. Right? What is the danger that great power competition with China or with Russia would yield enough sort of policy success to justify the resources? And could we talk about what are the resources that would be necessary and what would policy success look like?
Yeah. So the first kind of, I mean, this is, I guess, another little hobby horse of mine. Great power competition is important. It's just not all important. I mean, there are other things that the United States wants to achieve in the world other than successfully compete with China and Russia. And it can be at the top of our agenda, but it can't be the only item on our agenda or be so dominant that it distorts our focus on other things, as I think the war on terrorism did. I mean, I thought the war on terrorism, and I continue to think the war on terrorism was the right thing to do, given what happened to us on September 11, 2001, and what looked like it might happen to us down the line. But I mean, I worked on the National Security Council staff, and I remember sitting in meetings with the Vietnamese when they were trying to kind of further normalize their relations with the United States. And the number one talking point was, we need you with us on terrorism. Well, I mean, not really, actually. I mean, like shouldn't actually be the number one agenda item between the United States and Vietnam. I mean, Saudi Arabia, sure. Vietnam, not so much. And so it has the potential for this crowding out. And I already see a little bit of this when people will look at regions of the world and they say, America's big interest in Latin America is to keep the Chinese out, or Africa, and yes, there is a global competition is going to have regional effects and all these other things. But Africa, we have many more interests in Africa and Latin America than just whether the Chinese get advantage or don't get advantage. That is one element of a more complicated policy. And there's this kind of habit in Washington where people kind of they'll wake up and they'll realize, oh my God, everything we've been doing is wrong, and now we have to completely overcompensate. So after 9/11, it was global war on terror. We need a global counterinsurgency. We need multiple wars going on at the same time. This is existential. If there's a 1% risk, then we have to go after it now. We can't sit by, and we've taken a holiday from history. We were focused on small, insignificant things like China and Russia for the whole 1990s. Of course, now it's like, oh my God, we've been bogged down in the sands of the Middle East and these endless wars that for no conceivable purpose. And we totally overreacted to the war on terror, and more people die in their bathtub than die in terrorist attacks. What were we thinking? It's all about China and Russia, China and Russia. It's not all about any of these things. It's, you can weight these, but it's not about all of these things. And if you, and even within government, there can be a certain distorting effect to this. I mean, you already see people justifying budget requests within the government by framing it in great power competition, terms, GPC, as they call it at the Pentagon. Just like I saw, the most tangential things were being justified as like, the war of ideas and the war on terror, years ago, and things like that. Right. What you have to do is assign kind of priorities of these things. And again, great power competition can be at the top. And then try to have a clear-eyed view of what kind of resources are going to be devoted toward that, so that there are other resources to do other important things as well. Maybe less important things, but important nevertheless. And so, ultimately, there's various aspects to how we're going to need to expend our resources in this competition. It's not just build a military bigger than theirs, or have or whatever. There's going to be, through the various vectors, there's going to be resources that will need to be spent: technology, diplomacy, ideology, military, economic, and you can sort of go around. But I guess the last thing I would say, as we're thinking through what kind of resources we need to devote and how we should devote them, and this will be my last like hobby horse kind of thing, what we don't want to do is try to out-China China. So now I sometimes hear, well, China's got a list of the key technologies that it is putting all of these billions of dollars of government revenue into in order to dominate the commanding heights of AI. And, so let's do the same thing. Like, where are our billions that are going to go into these things? China has an industrial policy. We got to get ourselves an industrial policy. China has one belt, one road, and it's building infrastructure. We got to have our own one belt, one road. The key is not to compete with them one for one, where they're the starting and we sort of compete, which will ultimately be lesser economic resources because we have a different model than they do with this state capitalism. But to actually find what are the asymmetric areas of advantage to us. And that's where I think actually the United States has within us everything necessary to compete effectively with China. The innovative economy, the world-class universities, the freedom, the open ideas, the people exchange, the size of the economy, you can go on and on and on, the military innovation. But it's doubling down on the strengths, not just trying to compensate for what China's doing, that I think is the key to this.
That's very wise. And I want to turn to, I think, a wise observation made by one of our audience members. Shahid noted that we in the West think in terms of blocks and alliances, as you've mentioned, but in my observation, China is cognizant of that, but does not think entirely that way. They've been quietly building military and economic power, while the rest of us were engaged in the Cold War, and with their advantages in the cost of labor and lower cost of manufacturing, they've basically been able to develop a stronger economic sort of strategy and establish commercial relations rather than focusing on alliance. And I think that agrees with some of the observations you made. And if I can sort of weave in another question from an audience member, from Marge and Bill Eckhart, they cite Walter Russell Mead, who's argued, I guess, that technology and fracking are two of the sources of American power outside of the government, right? In the same way that if Shahid is right, that the US government thinks too much about what the government can do and not enough about the private sector, the economy, I guess Marge and Bill are asking, could you comment on sort of our advantages in terms of technology and in terms of fracking, I guess energy resources in general, as sort of advantages in this competition that's unfolding?
Sure. So I totally agree. Fracking is a major advantage economically and ultimately geopolitically for the United States. It's done a couple of things. I mean, one, the nature of fracking and the kind of easily on and off on this has kept the price of oil low, which is good for the US economy ultimately. But it's also put us in the position that even when the price of oil goes up, we're not only losers the way we used to be, because we actually have producers that get revenue when the price of oil goes up. And so it's been economically beneficial to the United States. It's also had an effect that I think we're just starting to sense on the way we think about the Middle East, and therefore the way we think about our sort of relative distribution of focus around the world. I mean, I was one of those who always thought, one of the reasons why we're in the Middle East, you can go back to the Carter Doctrine. Why did we want to ultimately keep the Soviets out of Afghanistan? Because we thought they would pose a threat to the Middle East. The Middle East is where the oil is. We import the oil from the Middle East. The US economy is very sensitive to the price of oil. And if you care about the well-being of Americans, their jobs, their livelihoods, their standard of living, you got to care about the price of oil. Therefore, you got to care about the Middle East. So you can't have somebody who's going to dominate the Middle East or be able to move that price of oil up or cut off supplies or anything. When that happened with the oil embargoes, we really hurt badly. That was part of the reason to go after Saddam Hussein and Kuwait and so forth. Then when we started fracking, it remained the case that while there were price differentials between, a barrel of crude made in, produced in North Dakota and a barrel of crude that was kind of on the global market, it was a price differential. It still kind of rose and fell. And so the idea was a geopolitical event in the Middle East that could spike the price of oil. And so even if we don't import any physically, we're still sensitive to the price. And therefore we still care about geopolitical issues in the Middle East. Well, then along comes Iran and launches this breathtaking attack on Saudi Arabia that knocks out 50% of all Saudi oil production in one strike. This is the textbook case of when oil prices are supposed to spike, America gets dragged into the Middle East and has to do something about this in order to quiet the markets and therefore preserve economic prosperity in the United States. But oil prices went up for a night and they came back down because there's so much production on the market. It turned out that you could actually destroy Saudi Arabia, 50% of Saudi Arabia's ability to produce oil, and it was barely a blip because of fracking, because of excess supply, just so many producers out there. If we are less sensitive to the Middle East as an oil supplier, at least conceptually, that can make us less sensitive to geopolitical events there and less sort of needing to run after everything that happens in the Middle East, and therefore, get sort of tied down there at the expense of what we're trying to do in places like the Indo-Pacific. So that's one way to sort of think about this. The other, with respect to the first question, it's important, I think, and again, this is a lesson you can actually draw from the Cold War, this distinguish between, for example, what China does that matters and what it really doesn't. So for example, we care a lot, I care a lot, I think we should care a lot, about whether Huawei builds out the 5G network in the United States or in key allies of ours with whom we have close communications, and therefore our data is traveling over Chinese owned or run networks. I think we should care about that. I don't really think that it's that big of a deal to us if they build out the 5G network in Papua New Guinea or Vanuatu. I mean, it's just not something to go to the mat on, and Huawei's cheaper, right? But if China wants to build a naval base in Vanuatu, then suddenly I care about that, right? So naval base, yeah, I care about. 5G, I don't care about, even though I care about 5G in some other places. So the answer to these things is not, and actually I think sometimes the administration falls into this problem of, Huawei bad, 5G bad, China bad everywhere. I mean, that's a recipe to distribute your efforts across everything. It has to be a far more differentiated approach that's issue by issue, that's focused on the issues that matter and ignores the issues that don't matter to us. And that's kind of what I think is the next phase of the competition with China, is figuring out which falls into those categories.
Great. Turning to a related question from Jeremy Ross. So if competition with China is not going to be about geographic containment, as you said, right? Will it be about institutional leadership or influence? And if so, what are the important areas for the US to focus on to accomplish that? And a related question from Stephen Slaughter is the potential for increased cohesion in multi-state unions like the EU or ASEAN. Are they going to allow them to rise and challenge or I will add balance maybe US or Chinese or Russian efforts? Right. So a question about sort of institutions and a question about what about all the other countries in the world besides China, Russia, and the United States?
Yeah, so it's very much a competition for institutional leadership. And some of these things get pretty damn mundane. I mean, there are technical standard setting bodies that China increasingly seeks to dominate so that its technical standards will apply globally as opposed to ones favored by the United States or by the West. And sometimes these have kind of free speech implications if it's technological standards or whatever. And then certainly in the international organizations, China is increasingly taking leadership roles in UN agencies, to include Chinese nationals running some of these. And here's where I'm afraid that actually our approach recently has not been the right one. I mean, it does seem peculiar how sympathetic the World Health Organization was at the beginning of this year to the Chinese position on coronavirus. I mean, I was at the Munich Security Conference in February, I guess. And the head of the World Health Organization was there. He was careful to sort of praise China's response and all this other stuff, which seemed peculiar to me because its response didn't seem terribly praiseworthy. But the answer to that kind of stuff is for the United States to get in there and increasingly set the agenda and show leadership and rally countries not to just abandon the playing field. If you're worried about too much Chinese influence in the World Health Organization with the United States in it, imagine what it's going to be like with the United States out of it. But yet, we withdrew from the World Health Organization. So now China has much more freedom to dictate that agenda. And that's the kind of thing that I think is unwise ultimately. And what I think we're going to have is competition in these international organizations and in these kind of mundane, obscure technical standard setting bodies and things like that, that actually has some pretty important implications. So that's on that. I mean, on ASEAN and some of these other countries, I mean, what most countries want is some mixture of security and economic benefits from both China and the United States. So again, the answer is a differentiated one than kind of a binary one. We're not going to take India as a great example of this. I mean, India is increasingly aligning with the United States. For all its talk of non-alignment, it's aligning increasingly with the United States, in part, but not exclusively, because of its worries about what Chinese dominance in the region would mean. But it still wants benefits from China. It still has a robust economic relationship with China. It doesn't want to provoke China, et cetera, et cetera. So a US-India alliance against China is not in the cards. So if you think about balance of power as kind of classical balance of power, you know, we need to have an alliance against these guys bigger than the alliance they have against us or whatever. It ain't gonna work. What you have to do is have kind of incremental alliances on issues that matter most. And it turns out to be a much more complicated thing than just, you know, a balance where we tally up all the friends and allies of this country and then we tally up all the ones on the other one, and whoever is, you know, is got more, they're sort of, you know, dominant. Or if it's in rough balance, then it's balanced. It's harder than that, because no one, including us, is going to sign up to that. And there are areas where, you know, countries will sign up to some things in some areas, but not into others. And so what we want ultimately is to have more allies and partners on our side on more issues that matter.
Great, thank you. And this pivots nicely to this next question, which is about space policy, right? So Jonathan Roll asks about China's Space Silk Road initiative, right? It's put a lot of resources in recent years into space exploration and into rocketry, and as has, I guess, under the Trump administration with the formation of the Space Force. What should the US do going forwards to contend with China in cyberspace and outer space? And do you see, he lays out a few scenarios, if I could summarize them, they're kind of like, do we need a reset with China to work in tandem in this sort of common challenge area in the same way that I guess the US and Soviet Union did for space? Should the US rely on its commercial actors to take the lead here and as an alternative to the Chinese state-run companies? Should the US sort of put in another sort of government resources to do another kind of Sputnik, post-Sputnik kind of space challenge in order to meet this kind of growing Chinese investments in space and cyberspace?
So I would distinguish between space and cyberspace, because I think the answers to the question are totally different in those two domains. On space, it's possible for me to imagine arms control-like agreements on in some discrete areas. You know, on space debris, for example, which, if you know anything about this, is a big problem. And you know, and China conducted an anti-satellite test years ago that put a whole lot more space debris out there. Both countries have an interest in minimizing the amount of space debris and debris, not creating more. Could they have some sort of agreement toward that end? Sure. You know, both the United States and China have satellites that are used for nuclear command and control. You know, in the world we live in now, if you wanted to try to, in some fantasy world, go after someone's nuclear arsenal with a preemptive strike, you'd probably go after their satellites first, not their nukes first. So could we have some sort of agreement with China to not target each other's satellites that are, you know, implicated in nuclear command and control, just for basic stability reasons? Yeah, maybe. It's almost impossible for me to see how we get to any sort of cyber agreement with China. I mean, it's hard to attribute, you know, cyber attacks. It's hard to verify. You don't have the kind of verification protocols that you're able to have with concrete things that you can see up in space or on the ground. And it's just much more difficult for a whole variety of reasons. That's when it comes to actual sort of formal agreements. But it is the case that the Chinese will listen to what the number one item on the American agenda is. And when Barack Obama met with Xi Jinping, and he made the theft through cyber means of US intellectual property the number one issue in the relationship, and said, this cannot go on the way it is. We know what you're doing. It's gotta stop. The Chinese diminished by some accounts more than 50%. They didn't go to zero, but by a meaningful, significant margin, the amount of intellectual property they were stealing through cyber means. There was no written agreement. You'd never get one of those, but it did result in results. When President Trump came in, he didn't really care that much about it. And the big ask became, we got to lower the trade deficit, and we need to, make sure that you guys buy more things that are sold in swing states and things like that. And suddenly the focus was the trade talks and how do we do this? And it went right back up to where it was before. So I'm very pessimistic about, a formal agreement on cyber norms or behavior, but I don't think that we need to be hopeless about affecting each other's cyber behavior through many of the more classical tools of statecraft: diplomacy, deterrence, threats, coercion, incentives, the whole thing.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's very important to distinguish sort of the differences between cyber and outer space sort of policy. But I missed an important part of Jonathan's question, which is the multilateral dimension. So you talked a little bit about bilateral arms control being maybe possible in space, maybe not in cyber. What about multilateral norm establishment that brings in, let's say, the EU and Japan and others on both space and cyber? How should we think about new international rules or norms being written on this area?
Yeah, I mean, again, to distinguish them, I mean, I think multilateral, depending on what the it is you're talking about, a multilateral agreement to not target each other's nuclear-related satellites would probably not make a lot of sense for some countries because they lack the capability or the will to do that stuff in the first place. But the US and China both suspect the other of engaging that behavior, right? So for the same reason that, the US and the Soviet Union had bilateral arms control negotiations, even though France and Israel and the UK and India and Pakistan and North Korea all have nuclear weapons. They just weren't party to it because it was seen as a separate challenge. On cyber, again, I guess I'm about as maybe even more pessimistic about multilateral actual agreements, treaty type stuff on cyber behavior because of the difficulty I described before. But that's not to say you can't work toward the evolution of norms that you can then try to enforce and impose through other ways. It's just less absolute. From a multilateral kind of arms control thing, the interesting case right now is the US and Russia trying to negotiate a follow-on to the New START agreement that is up for either renewal or termination relatively soon. It can either be extended by 5 years by fiat, essentially. And the opening position of the US government was, well, we'll only do this if China's party to the negotiations as well. Which has some logic, right? The New START puts a cap on the number of nuclear weapons that both the United States and Russia can deploy. The problem is, that number is in a couple thousands, 2,550 or so, and China's got, maybe 200. And so either China would have to agree to a limit far less than that of the United States and Russia, and it's hard to imagine why they would, or they could agree to a ceiling far higher than what they have now, which also doesn't seem very good for us because we don't want them to go up in the number of nuclear weapons they have. And so sort of admired the inclusiveness of the ask, but they've defaulted to let's just do this on U.S. and Russia, and maybe we can separately talk to the Chinese at some point. So this multilateralism is hard in these areas.
Right. With apologies to audience members, I'm going to ask one final question. We didn't get to it. This conversation sparked a lot of great commentary and questions. So maybe if, with Richard's permission, I can post both of our Twitter handles into the chat, and if folks want to engage with us or message us, we can engage there. But I want to ask one final question to wrap up the formal part of the event and link it back to the elections, right? So great power competition really made a big splash or return, strikes back with the Trump administration's national security strategy. It's one of the rare areas that there's bipartisan sort of agreement on in broad contours, right? Could you talk a little bit about what the Trump administration, has done right on great power competition, and what a Biden administration, if it were elected, what it might do different than, right? So the things that Trump administration's done well, things that the Biden administration would change.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think overall, the Trump administration doesn't get nearly enough credit in my mind for the profound conceptual shift that has occurred over the past almost 4 years, which, as you say, sort of was adopted right off the bat by Republicans and Democrats, including Democrats who can't stand the Trump administration. But suddenly, when they sort of pointed out that we're in this world of great power competition, that China's not a strategic partner, but rather a strategic competitor, that we are in this competition among these various, with these two countries in various domains, everybody kind of said, yeah, actually, you know what, that's right. And you wouldn't think necessarily of the Trump administration having, produced this major bipartisan conceptual breakthrough, but in fact, they have done that. So I think the if there's a Biden administration, I think they would be good to retain the general disposition of, we are in a fundamentally competitive relationship with China, that we want neither to be, we want neither to be too quiescent about it, nor so confrontational that it bleeds into potential conflict. I mean, that's the sweet spot we want to remain in over the long run. So I think that the Biden administration would do well to retain that. What I think the Biden administration could do is reorder the priorities. So if I think about US-China relations, and I think about the president's #1 objective, it seems to have been increased purchases of American goods and agricultural products and a reduction in the trade deficit. I don't think that's the right priority. In fact, I wouldn't put that on my top 10. With all love to everybody in Missouri and Kansas and everything. I mean, geopolitically, that first of all, it hasn't worked terribly well. But even if it did, the trade deficit is a poor measure of kind of the health of any economic relationship. I would say the theft of intellectual property through cyber means is actually much more important. The potential meddling in our political system, which we see flickers of Chinese interest in, is more important. And you can sort of go down things. So one is that. The other is, I think, a challenge for the Biden administration, if there is one, is their instinct, which I think will be quite right, will be to use the scalpel rather than the meat cleaver. So instead of having the vice president and the Secretary of State, as Pompeo and Pence did, go out and these kind of throw down the gauntlet about the nature of China, and by God, we now see how it is. Who's with us? And countries, even ones that are pretty skeptical of China, go, hey, is this going to be the policy a year from now? Let's not be too hasty here, guys. I think that they can take a more nuanced approach, but the danger is going to be that they pull back too far in the name of sort of trying. I think it would be wrong to kind of reset relations with China, or try to, the way the Obama administration did with Russia. Chinese interests are not going to change because our administration changed. Chinese sort of decision making and their notion of themselves and where they belong in the world don't fundamentally turn on who we elect, and it's not just all about us. And we need to take that seriously and take it into account. And and understand, I think, that there are reasons why we can get along with China in some areas, and then there's reasons to be pretty skeptical that we can in other areas. I think the final challenge, I think, for the Biden administration is they will come in with a far greater priority on global issues, global warming, climate change, and pandemic disease, for obvious reasons. Whereas there is no cooperation between the United States and China on pandemic disease in the middle of a global pandemic, and the Trump administration doesn't really place any priority on climate change. So these are areas of theoretical possibilities where you can cooperate with China. So if there are areas where you're going to try to cooperate that are very important to you, and there are areas to compete with them where competition is deemed necessary, do you dampen the competitive spirit so as not to infect the areas that you would like to cooperate, sort of poison the well? And that's a tough thing to work out. And I hope that they don't allow the potential of uber cooperative relationship on these important issues to drown out the reality that we are in fundamentally competitive situation in a bunch of issue areas, because I don't think the Chinese will. I just don't think the Chinese will say, well, we want to cooperate with you on X, Y, and Z, so we'll really stop competing in these other areas. I think they will just keep competing. And so, so we have to sort of do the same thing and balance both.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up? I know we're running over time, but something that's come up in the debates, right, is the idea of the Biden administration, when it asks about foreign policy, will say, we're going to work with our allies more, that Trump has isolated sort of U.S. allies. What is your comment on the sort of the multilateral approach when it comes to the great power competition? Are we, is the Biden administration going to be able to bring friends and allies and a coalition of the willing into great power competition vis-a-vis China in particular, but potentially Russia as well?
I think that it's a critical part of this, in part because this is one of the greatest assets and asymmetrical advantages the United States has. Like we were saying before, the United States has a lot of allies and a lot of partners, and China really doesn't have allies. It has partners of a sort, and we tend to share some values that we want to protect with key democracies around the world, and that's important. So I think, there are certain ways in which, even if you take the Trump administration's kind of economics first agenda with China, it would have been more effective had it been multilateralized. So if anybody can put their brain back to the disastrous G7 meeting in Canada when the president kind of unsigned the final communique and trashed the Canadians and all this other kind of stuff. In my mind, we have a lot of differences with the other G7 countries on here and there, but fundamentally, a lot of us have the same economic worries about China, right? The role of state-owned enterprises, unfair investment rules, theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but we did all this bilaterally. We're trying to coerce them into doing something different bilaterally. The G7 shouldn't have been about Canada, the United States. It should have been about how we're all together on the same page and gone, together, which, is what, 60% of the global economy instead of what the US has. And as much of a united front as we could to say, hey, look, we've got a few really demands here that we need to see some satisfaction. Let's talk about this. And we're going to talk about this as a block, as a unified kind of thing. And so that's on one set of issues. The other thing is, and this is less about China than about Russia sometimes. The Europeans are worried about Russia post Ukraine in a way that they weren't before. But the president has made it pretty damn hard to be unabashedly pro-American or be seen as pro-Trump administration in some key capitals like Berlin. And so that limits the explicit closeness and alignment that we can have in some key areas, because nobody wants to be seen as sort of kowtowing to the guy that's making your life a domestically political living hell all the time, or saying that he doesn't believe in NATO, or it's just a bunch of free riders, or they don't pay their bills, or Germany, whatever, and things like that. And if you can remove that irritation and actually make it that working with the United States or working with an American president is an attractive thing for a politician in a European country, as opposed to something that they have to do despite the political cost, then that'll only make it easier to work with these countries against these issues that we have in common. So I hope we do some of that.
Thank you so much, Richard. I've learned a tremendous amount. I hope our audience members also enjoyed this conversation. Back to over the mat. Thank you.
Yeah, Jack and Richard, thank you so much. What a fabulous conversation and a really important exploration that I think touches on a lot of the series programs we've had so far. And you did some nice foreshadowing of our remaining two. Next week, Iran, North Korea, and nuclear proliferation. So talking about that multilateral approach. And then the final week of the series, looking at American leadership and multilateralism writ large. So it should be a fascinating conclusion. But thank you to both of you. Thank you as well to our sponsors, to the engaged audience members, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.